Ben Cardin, and welcome to Facebook Live. This is an opportunity that I use on a periodic basis to inform the people of our community about what is happening in Congress, the transition to the Biden administration, the issues that are important to the people of Maryland, to have a discussion with experts. And today we're going to talk about the civil rights priorities in the new administration, and that is a very exciting topic. I must tell you, we have two experts on this area to join me today that have been in this fight for a long time. Vanita Gupta, who is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, and Wendy Weiser, who directs the democracy programs at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. I just want to start this off by saying that I've had a chance to interview several of the nominees of President-elect Biden to key positions in the administration. We've talked with some in the State Department, in the economic plans, in the security areas. And I must tell you, the justice in this country, human rights, appointments to the bench, those issues have been front and center in our discussion. And each one of these nominees have said that they're really looking forward to advancing a program consistent with the values of this nation. What a contrast to the Trump administration. And they all said, look, President-elect Biden's made it clear that he wants us to exercise our judgment to move forward on these issues. But we all take our cue from the president-elect, who is committed to the democratic principles of our country, to the fact that this nation over its entire history has been on a path towards more justice and a path towards advancing civil rights for all people in this country. And we're still on that path, and we still have a way to go. So I think these are going to be exciting times. I hope that instead of trying to block some bad things from happening, we're actually going to see the next Congress, under the leadership of the Biden administration, advance the agenda for civil rights. Now, clearly, we've had a lot with the justice and policing and the episodes, and we'll talk a lot about that. We've also had the voting rights issues that have been front and center in this nation. We've had so many areas in regards to civil rights that we need an agenda to move forward with. So I want to start, if I might, with Vanita. Just if you could, maybe not everyone's familiar with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Could you just tell us what that organization's all about?
Sure. And Senator Cardin, thank you for having me. Always great to be with you, and really grateful for your leadership, and also with my colleague and friend Wendy Weiser, who does extraordinary voting rights work at the Brennan Center. So the Leadership Conference is this year celebrating our 70th anniversary. We were founded in 1950 by Jewish African-American labor leaders here in Washington, out of the theory that the fight for civil and human rights couldn't be won by one group or one community alone, but really needed to be waged in coalition. And obviously, the face of civil rights, the conditions in 1950 were quite different than they are today. We've made a decent amount of progress, but with a lot of pain along the way, of course, and we always have to be vigilant. But the fight for voting rights was really at the seeding of our organization, and remains a top priority today. Today, we're a staff of about 100 people, and we pulled together, we're a coalition of over 220 civil rights organizations, including the Brennan Center. And our goal is to bring people together across our organizations to work together strategically in furtherance of some key campaigns and issues, from the census to voting rights to policing and justice reform, and to some of the other topics that I know we're going to talk about today. And right now, and I just want to say this in closing out my answer, I want to echo what you said, Senator. It has been a very dark 4 years for civil rights in this country, and it feels really hopeful to be in this place, to be thinking about and carving and shaping, as the Leadership Conference is doing, an agenda for the next 4 that is affirmative, We know it's going to take a lot of work. We know we're going to hold all of the members of Congress and the administration accountable for furthering civil and human rights, but we're going to be supporting and pushing. And but this feeling of hope, I think, is something we shouldn't lose sight of, because it's been hard the last 4 years as a civil rights leader to have it. But I'm really appreciative of your leadership on these issues, notwithstanding the conditions then, and I'm excited about it moving forward.
So, Wendy, I want to give you equal time to talk a little bit about the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Tell me a little bit about the mission of that center.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me as well. The Brennan Center is a think tank and public interest law center, nonpartisan, that works to reform, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice. We do extensive research. We craft policies. We fight for change in coalition with allies like the Leadership Conference, and we litigate where necessary in order to bring about a fairer, more just, more equitable, and more participatory America. And I want to echo the hopefulness at the moment and my gratitude to you, Senator, for your leadership in crafting and leading the way on some of the critical reforms that we now need to turn to and that we now have an opportunity to work on going forward. And also the leadership of many of your fellow Maryland lawmakers, like Representative Sarbanes, also even Chris Van Hollen, the late Elijah Cummings, and even even Speaker Pelosi, who can be claimed by Maryland as well. And we have a real opportunity this year to now turn the corner and really start moving forward on democracy and justice. We all saw a relentless and unprecedented series of attacks on the twin foundations of our democratic system, on the free and fair elections, on the rule of law. We saw unconscionable and unpunished police violence against Black and Brown Americans. We saw law enforcement weaponized for personal and partisan gain. We saw all these dark things, but we also witnessed an unprecedented mobilization in defense of democracy and justice in our country. Americans turned up in numbers to support Black lives. They showed up to support essential healthcare workers, and they showed up in droves to vote. We had record voter turnout this year, despite the unprecedented challenges and attacks on the voting system. More Americans turned out than in any election in over a century, and this was made possible not because the system was functioning well, but because of the extraordinary mobilization across all sectors to uphold the electoral system, our democracy, to make sure that in the midst of this pandemic and in the midst of this attack on our democracy, it would work. And that is now bringing us to a place where we can actually make these changes so that it will work going forward. And I'm very enthusiastic to get to work.
Well, thank you. As the senator from Maryland, I'm going to take it my prerogative to start first with the problems of the Baltimore policing, the Freddie Gray issue. I want to take advantage of Vanita being on this call because you were in the Department of Justice and was part of the pattern and practice investigation that took place by the Department of Justice after the tragic death of Freddie Gray, which led to the agreement to move forward with a consent decree. I guess my question to you, we saw throughout the nation the outrage with systemic racism in policing. And we know that this is going to be one of the first challenges that are going to be confronted by the Biden administration. I am very interested in what we do in our national response, and I've introduced two major bills, the Racial and Religious Profiling Act and the Law Enforcement Integrity and Trust Act, that are included in the Justice and Policing Act. But I'm also interested as to what's going to happen in Baltimore. How do we help our urban centers where we have way too much violence on the streets, and we still do not have the confidence of communities that law enforcement's really working for their neighborhoods and not discriminating against their neighborhoods because their neighborhoods of color. So what advice would you give the Biden administration on dealing with this really challenging issue?
Well, thank you, Senator. as you know, there is no easy solution to these deep and entrenched problems. And the energy and activism that we saw pouring out into the streets after George Floyd's murder this summer, I think really was a call for a different way of envisioning and thinking about public safety, one that doesn't just involve the police and the criminal legal system, but that actually is also looking at how healthcare matters with people who may be experiencing crisis, how we deal with schools and jobs and other issues that are facing communities. I remember, Senator, when I was the head of the Civil Rights Division, and we did this very extensive investigation in Baltimore, being at a town hall meeting where community members were talking about policing and concerns about the police and saying that they just don't trust them to give them information about crime, which is a real problem. This is what happens, when there is this fundamental erosion of trust. Victims stop coming forward. Victim witnesses may stop speaking to officers and the like. But they were also talking about their schools and their roads and jobs and transportation, and you felt a little bit helpless, where policing issues were sometimes the tip of the spear of what is confronting communities. And so the Baltimore consent decree obviously remains in motion. These consent decrees never get solved or kind of are complied with overnight. To fix institutional culture and change, it requires time, it requires leadership. And of course, Baltimore has had its own turmoil of a lot of different leaders who have been in the city, which I think my sense, and I've been obviously on the outside of this for the last 4 years, has taken a little bit of a toll on where the consent decree is, but I still have tremendous hope for it. I know Commissioner Harrison is committed to the consent decree, and I will say seeing his leadership in New Orleans with the New Orleans consent decree was fairly significant, but there needs to be political will and the backing of a Justice Department that actually believes in this work. And unfortunately, as you know, the Trump Justice Department really halted most of that work and did not support the existing consent decrees. The hope is that a Biden administration recognizes the importance of this intervention. It's one that is very judiciously used by the Department of Justice, and that Baltimore and the communities in Baltimore deserve the kinds of remedies that have been put in place through the consent decree. And one thing that I think was significant about the Baltimore consent decree is actually its prescience for recognizing that policing can't be the answer to everything. There's actually built into that consent decree a need for having city investment in behavioral health supports for people in need, so that police officers aren't the only go-to response, for instance, when people are in crisis, and that mental health professionals are also engaged, can de-escalate effectively situations where otherwise force might be used. And this is part of what I have been hearing as the call in communities over the summer and through some of the more recent tragedies, is recognizing that we cannot just approach these issues through exclusively a criminal legal response or arrest and incarceration. It's actually where I think a lot of police officers and protesters come together, is saying, like, we have been put in this position to have to handle a whole host of problems that have resulted as a result of systemic disinvestment of other kind of social supports in our communities. So my hope is the Biden Justice Department will not only kind of reinvigorate this work and support it, but also look to how other parts of the federal government can support cities and leaders at the local level to kind of engage a more holistic look at what it means to create public safety in their communities, and to be able to really put the power behind this, as well as the laws that you're talking about, which I was honored to testify for in the Senate and the House, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that sets some important standards, like a national use of force standard, banning the use of chokeholds, ending the transfer of military grade equipment to local jurisdictions in most cases. That's just 3 of the provisions. But it's been a long time since Congress has passed a law on policing. And it's important, I think, for the American people nationally to see Congress take these issues seriously and make this bill a law.
Well, I agree with you completely. I'm a strong co-sponsor of the Justice and Policing Act. Of course, the House acted on it. We hope in the 117th Congress, we're going to be able to get that enacted. The reforms that are there are critically important to restore trust. I want to underscore 2 points that you made. One, I met with the community in Sandtown after the Freddie Gray episode. And exactly what you said, I heard. These are good people. I know them. And these are community leaders. But they were worried about working with the local police that it would turn into a discriminatory action against the people from their community, that they would not be treated fairly. And that, of course, leads to an untenable situation between the community and police. And that's a good deal what the consent decree is aimed at doing. The second thing I just want to underscore is shortly after that episode, I was brought to the White House under the leadership of President Obama, and he had all of his cabinet people there that could make a difference in Baltimore with the instructions, go to work and get something done to help Baltimore get out of this situation. And they did provide us resources. They provided us resources for community facilities in communities that don't have recreational facilities, don't have they have food deserts, they don't have health facilities, so that we could do something to improve the services within the community itself. They provided money for summer employment for youth. These are programs that can really help the community and restore that type of confidence. Instead, when President Trump took office, he tried to end all the consent decrees, including the one in Baltimore. And thankfully for our federal bench, they went forward with our consent decree. So we were able to continue to do that. So I couldn't agree with you more. We really do need not only to make sure this is carried out, but to make sure there's resources to make it work. Wendy, it's not just policing. Systemic racism and discrimination is in our society. And if you want to look at one of the prime examples, take a look at COVID-19. Take a look at who's been impacted, what community has suffered the most, and their communities of color, their low-income communities. It just points out, once again, that because of problems that pre-exist COVID-19, where we don't have the same access to care in all communities, and we certainly didn't distribute the protection equally in all communities or to all fields where there is a large number of minorities that work, that these consequences were much more severe. So what is the game plan for the advocates of civil rights to recognize that, yes, we have to deal with justice and policing, but we can't stop there?
Yeah, the problems of racial inequities are systemic, as you pointed out, and they do pervade all aspects of our society and of our government systems. And there are a couple of places where I think it's really important to start to turn the corner and that the administration should really focus on. And the first, as we were talking about the Department of Justice in policing, I think the Department of Justice can play a very significantly important role in helping to enforce civil rights, enforce voting rights, and helping to undo some of the damaging rollbacks of civil rights that have happened over the last 4 years. And I think a real commitment to not only ensuring a commitment to civil rights at all level of appointments of the Department of Justice, but ensuring that there is a rule of law and that is respected throughout, and that the tools of our enforcement of our civil rights laws are used fully. We had, over the last 4 years, there has not been a single enforcement action brought, for example, under the Voting Rights Act. In contrast to any other administration, including Republican and Democratic administrations. And that is a travesty, and we've seen the damage. Relatedly, and another very significant thing that must happen if we want to get to a place where we can really address the racial inequities in our society is we need to shore up our democracy, bolster voting rights, and the other systemic problems that are giving Americans unequal voice in our society, skewing our outcomes. And toward that end, I think that there is a lot of work that could be done legislatively. For the PEOPLE Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Act, which you support and which both the president-elect and the vice president-elect have been supported, are key priorities to get America back on track, where we are not attacking and excluding significant portions of our population in our democracy, and give everybody an equal voice and say, so that they can actually have a chance to have a say over what happens in their community.
So let's dissect this a little bit in regards to voting rights. We have just finished our national elections, and there were challenges to the integrity of the system by President Trump. The attacks were just ridiculous and demeaning, and very much question Mr. Trump's commitment to our democratic systems of government. We know that. But to me, it was somewhat ironic that he was contesting states. We know why he picked the states he did. He lost those states. But he was challenging the fact that those states tried to allow people an opportunity to cast their votes during a pandemic in a safe manner by early voting and voting by mail. And I guess my complaint is just the opposite of Mr. Trump's. We have too many states that make it difficult for people to be able to cast a vote because they don't allow enough early voting or no early voting, or they have restrictions on voting by absentee, or they don't have enough voting locations to make it convenient for people to vote, or they put certain restrictions on registration to make it challenging for people to be able to participate in elections. And we've seen they try to push that envelope pretty far. The courts have pulled that back. But there is a challenge because we have a federalism system where the elections are controlled by local governments. H.R. 1, you've both referred to that. I'm very, very proud of John Sarbanes, my colleague, my congressman. He represents me in the Congress of the United States, has been the leader of that bill. And the fact that it's H.R. 1, the very first bill introduced in this Congress, tells you the priority put on it by the Democrats and Speaker Pelosi. But just comment a little bit about how we really are still on that path to empower the voting rights for all Americans, where in many cases there's been subtle ways, in some cases not such subtle ways, to discourage individuals from voting. You can continue, Wendy. I know this is one of your subjects.
All right. Well, thank you. I mean, we really saw both, as I noted this year, not only real mobilization to actually try to expand the opportunities Americans had to vote and all the choices they had, but massive barriers across the country. And we saw the disparities where some Americans had lots of options and others didn't. Those disparities actually fell significantly along racial lines, as you noted. You know, the extraordinarily long lines that we saw in the primary elections were concentrated in high-density population areas where they were largely in neighborhoods and communities of color. This has been a consistent pattern. Our research shows that Black Americans wait on average in other elections 45% longer than white Americans, Latinos 46% longer. This is a consistent pattern over time. The fight over who could even access mail voting or early voting during a pandemic at a time when the public health crisis demanded it, where otherwise it would be forcing Americans to choose between their health and their right to vote, was extraordinary that it was even an issue. And that in so many states, there were some states where Americans had to provide an excuse, others where Americans had to find a witness or a notary in order to be able to cast an absentee ballot, when the main reason why they wanted to cast an absentee ballot was that they wanted to socially distance and not be in contact with potential infection. So we saw challenges throughout the process. what we need, and we saw differences across the country, and more than 300 lawsuits were filed just to basically get Americans a base level of access to voting rights this year. And it worked. We held it up. Most Americans were able to participate at an extraordinary effort, but the rifts remain. What we really need to see is a baseline set of federal standards that every American can rely on to access voting, so that the system can't be manipulated to knock out people you don't want to see voting, and people can't be targeted based on their race with technical obstacles to voting, but also so that every American has the same basic level of options to participate freely in our electoral process. And that's something that H.R. 1 does. It's also critically paired with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore and bolster protections, critical protections against discrimination in the voting rights process, that were hobbled by the Supreme Court now 7 years ago, and we are paying the consequences for that. And it would strengthen our democracy in other ways. Many Americans are feeling a representation deficit. They feel like they're living in neighborhoods where they're extremely gerrymandered political systems. They can't hold their representatives accountable, or where the money in politics makes them feel like their voice doesn't matter. H.R. 1 tackles those problems as well, and would put us on a firmer footing to have a stronger democracy going forward.
Vanita, I want to hear your response on this also. Of course, Wendy, you're referring to the Shelby Callahan case that we should have corrected a long time ago. It was a very disappointing decision by the Supreme Court, but it left an opening for Congress to fix it, and Congress has not fixed that decision, which is very important in regards to an approval process. And then, if you could also perhaps, Vanita, take up the democracy restoration for returning citizens. To me, this is one of the great travesties in our system of disenfranchising individuals, and it is very much aimed at people of color.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I mean, I want to underscore everything that Wendy said, and I want to also lift up Congressman Sarbanes' leadership on H.R. 1, but your sponsoring support. It's going to take a very concerted effort in this Congress to get it passed. And as you mentioned, we were also supportive of it when it passed the House in 2019. But it's time for this bill that passed the House to become law. There's no question that had so many of the provisions of H.R. 1 been law at the time that COVID hit our country, we wouldn't have had to have over 400 federal pieces of litigation, or I guess they weren't just federal, but litigation all over the country. And the kind of clamoring and crisis advocacy that so many of our organizations were doing with state and local election officials that were needing resources to be able to meet the pandemic. These provisions that are in H.R. 1 would have had expanded voting access in the states, and we wouldn't have had to have such an all hands on deck effort. And so, I think that it's really important to focus on this, that there are answers to these issues, that we are not kind of without solutions and just criticizing or expressing concern, but there are actually solutions on the table through H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. And I would add democracy restoration, Senator, as you mentioned. So H.R. 1 actually has provisions that would restore the right to vote for people who have served out their sentences in the criminal legal system. But this is, at least for federal elections, but there is a real need to examine this issue. As you know, in 2018, one of the most historic things that happened in that midterm election was that a majority of Floridians, bipartisan, voted for Amendment 4 that would restore the right to vote for countless Floridians. And then almost immediately after passage, it was met by an effort to undermine and dilute its impact and create more barriers, state-created barriers through the imposition of fines and fees for restoration of these voting rights and the like, and some of that work remains ongoing. But this need in this country now to finally address the scourge of permanent disenfranchisement of people who have served out their time in our criminal justice system, it needs to be addressed, and we need to recognize its history for what it is. And many states are really providing the model. As you know, Senator, many states have actually already taken the steps and have been implementing, and the Brennan Center knows all the facts and figures. I always rely on the Brennan Center for that. But there are a lot of great examples from states that had Republican and Democratic majority legislatures that took steps to restore the rights, the voting rights to people who've served out their sentences. Governors have done it through executive action as well. But it is high time for this country to kind of make these changes nationally. And it is our hope that we will press forward. I think criminal justice reform is one of the few remaining bipartisan issues, it seems sometimes. But this voting rights, we also need to build a bipartisan consensus for voting rights again in this country. It used to be that every time the Voting Rights Act was up for reauthorization, it happened under the watch of a Republican president and where one house of Congress was in Republican control. I think this issue is at the intersection of criminal justice reform and voting rights. And I think there's been a lot of momentum built, and we need to continue to forge forward on it to see justice, particularly given that Black communities and brown communities that are overrepresented in our criminal justice system are really the victims of these exclusions.
To me, this is one of our highest priorities. We're looking at a full package for returning citizens, not only the right to vote, but they are disenfranchised, for example, getting help in some of the small business programs. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So I know that Senator Booker is working very hard on that particular provision. So there's a whole range of areas that we're looking at for returning citizens, including the right to vote. And I know you all have been in the forefront on that. I do want to mention on voting, don't forget the people of the district who don't have a voice in the Congress of the United States. I raised that issue at our International Helsinki Commission, OSCE meetings, because I think that violates international standards. They should have voting represented. They should be a state, but they should have voting representation in the Congress and Senate of the United States.
And in fact, Senator, just quickly, I think Wendy and I often talk about this as like a triumvirate package. It's HR 1, HR 4, and HR 51, which is the bill for DC statehood. The Leadership Conference has long been a supporter of DC statehood, and you're absolutely right that this is an important issue for this country to also take up and for Congress to take up.
So I want to make sure I cover one of the subjects that I always get a surprise when I bring it up to some of my constituents, and that's the Equal Rights Amendment. After all, the prerequisite number of states have ratified that constitutional amendment, and yet it's still not part of our Constitution. I think people are surprised to know that we do not have an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution of the United States. We're the only nation, there's no nation that's developed a constitution since the end of World War II that does not have an Equal Rights Amendment in their constitution. So we've introduced bipartisan legislation to remove the arbitrary time limit that Congress imposed on the original Equal Rights Amendment initiative. And that passed the House of Representatives. We think we had the votes in the United States Senate to pass it, but Leader McConnell did not bring it up for vote in the United States Senate. I hope this will be a priority of the Biden administration. I think it's an extremely important thing. The late Justice Ginsburg, was one of her major requests. That she says if there could be one amendment added to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. Your thoughts?
Absolutely, we are fully supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment and think that it's really important to lead to better outcomes for gender equity in the country. Just not making gains quickly enough on pay inequity, violence against women, pregnancy discrimination, even on reproductive rights and rights for transgender individuals, for example. And if we had an ERA, we would be able to much more aggressively and quickly get to that equality that we're aiming for and that we're really lagging behind. And I want to add one of the critical elements of the ERA, like the critical elements on the voting rights side, is giving Congress additional power to fight sex and gender-based discrimination. And I think that Congress should be playing a much more significant role in the civil rights space in fighting against sex discrimination and race discrimination. And just as in the voting rights context, where Congress really has not only an important role, but according to the Supreme Court's recent decisions, the paramount role in protecting against voting discrimination and against other voting rights barriers in the states.
So we're cutting this Facebook Live session a little bit short today because there's a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. And I don't think any of you are going to be surprised to learn that this vote involves a judgeship. We've seen such an abuse by Leader McConnell on how judicial nominations have been handled. There really hasn't been a vetting process in the United States Senate, these are lifetime appointments. And many of the nominees are very young, so they're going to be on the bench for decades. And there has not been the screening. The ability for the minority to be able to have a reasonable chance to contest these nominations has been taken away. And of course, we know the abuse that Mitch McConnell did to President Obama and his choice of Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court, and then completely reversed himself and then some with the confirmation process of Justice Barrett. So we've seen this hypocrisy and this game plan by the Republicans in regards to judgeships. We are looking forward to President Biden submitting to us the type of nominees that will go through the confirmation process, but will be proud to confirm their nominations to our courts. We've had a good process in Maryland. We're very proud of our bench. We currently have one opening, and we are, Senator Van Hollen and I are soliciting nominations through a non-political process, working with the administration. And I do know that the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has been one in the forefront of recognizing that the damage that's been done to our bench under the Trump administration, and we need to restore that balance as part of our priorities in moving forward with civil rights in the new administration. Let me thank both of my guests for joining me. Vanita Gupta, who's the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a familiar face here on Capitol Hill, and Wendy Weiser, who directs the democracy programs at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. This has been a great discussion, but we just scratched the surface. But the good news is, and I know we're going to be continuing this discussion into January and beyond. And thank you all for viewing us today on Facebook Live.
Thank you.